Yeah, so basically, first example that we'll do of a waterfall analysis today is going to be a waterfall analysis problem where we've got 3 rounds of investment. So this is similar to the example that we did at the end of class last lecture. However, there's going to be one important difference, and this is the reason why I'm doing this extra example, is that in this particular example, we're going to have mandatory conversion. And the thing that's going to be important at a big picture level to understand with mandatory conversion is that mandatory conversion, when it binds, so when a stakeholder would rather not convert, but they are being forced to convert, by virtue of that preference, it means that when they're forced to convert, they lose money, their payoff goes down. And so what that's going to do, relative to the examples that we saw last lecture, is it's going to introduce discontinuities in the payoff diagram. So you'll have a payoff diagram where the stakeholder that is forced to convert shares has a drop in their payoff diagram. Now remember, a waterfall analysis is all about how the total value of a startup gets split between different stakeholders. And so what that means is one stakeholder's loss is other stakeholders' gain. So when you've got one stakeholder, suffering a drop in their payoff, the flip side is that there's going to be some other stakeholders who are going to get jumps in their payoff diagrams. Right? So today with our example, right, at least this example that we're going to do now, the main thing to get comfortable with is going to be, how do I measure the size of jumps and drops in payoff diagrams when I've got a capital structure that has mandatory conversion in at least one of the securities. Okay. So, one thing I can kind of promise in terms of complexity in a final exam question, you can expect at most 3 stakeholders like I have here. And I also promise that you'll at most have one of these 2 versions of securities. You'll either have a security with mandatory conversion like we have here, or you'll have a security that's participating preferred with a cap like we had in our last example. I won't give you guys an example where there's both of those because that just substantially increases the complexity and time to solve a problem. So you can pretty much assume that you'll have at most one of those 2 securities, but not both. Okay. Another thing to get out of this example is it's just another setting where we gain comfort with the mechanical algorithm for determining what happens first. So which optionality occurs first? Is it series A that converts? Is it series C that converts? Right? So we figure out what could possibly happen first, i.e. at the lowest exit value. We entertain all the possible scenarios and determine which scenario is the one that actually will happen first. And then after we figure out what happens first, then we figure out what happens second. It's this iterative process, right? And the thing that you want to be comfortable with is once you identify the set of things that can happen first, you then want to use logic and your understanding of the securities to be able to set up the equation to find out, well, if Series A converts first, what exactly is the equation that they consider when they're deciding, are they better off sticking with liquidation preference or converting? Right, so an important part of this process is to understand how you can, again, logically look at the securities that are in a company's capital structure, and from that figure out exactly how you do this waterfall analysis process. All right, so let's go ahead and just describe in this particular example what the capital structure of the startup is. So we're going to consider a startup that has raised 3 rounds of funding, right? Series A, Series B, and Series C. I'm going to assume that founders own 10 million shares of common equity. Series A owns 1 million shares of convertible preferred with a total of $20 million of liquidation preference. I'm quoting this here in dollar terms. I tell you the liquidation preference is 20 million. Another way that I could have quoted this is I could have said something like each share was bought at, let's say, $5 per share, and there's a liquidation preference multiple of 2, for instance. Well, in that case, 1 million shares bought at $5 per share would be 5 million with a liquidation preference multiple of 2. That would mean I need to change my numbers here. 1 million shares bought at $10 per share, right, with a liquidation preference multiple of 2 would mean that there would be a total of what? 1 million times 10 million, $10 per share, that's 10 million. Liquidation preference multiple of 2, so we multiply that by 2. That would be a total of $20 million of liquidation preference, right? So I can either, in practice, you either have this number quoted to you, or you have to calculate it on your own by factoring in, number of shares times price per share times liquidation preference multiple, and maybe an adjustment for dividends depending on what's described. I'll also assume that each share of convertible preferred can be converted to 2 shares of common. So in other words, if we convert these 1 million convertible preferred, they actually convert into 2 million shares of common. What about Series B? Series B will assume there are 2 million shares of participating preferred with, again, I'll quote in dollar terms, $20 million of liquidation preference. These are going to be convertible 1-to-1. So these 2 million shares can be, 2 million preferred shares can be converted into 2 million shares of common equity. But this investment round has mandatory conversion at a $250 million exit value. So what this means is if the startup gets sold either via acquisition or via an IPO at an amount greater than or equal to 250 million, Series B automatically converts to common equity. So it loses its liquidation preference. And then we've got Series C. Series C is 2 million shares of convertible preferred with a total of 60 million of liquidation preference, convertible 1-for-1. So basically can be converted to 2 million shares of common equity. And then the final thing I need to specify is the seniority structure of the liquidation preference. I'll assume that liquidation preference across all 3 rounds of funding is pari passu. That's just another way of saying equal seniority. Okay, so now, given our understanding of this capital structure, we can start figuring out, right, what the key breakpoints in our payoff diagram is going to be. So usually like as a first step in this analysis, I find it useful to ask, well, logically, what's the first thing that could happen, right? What first breakpoint could occur, after the liquidation preference range? It's pretty clear the liquidation preference range is going to be at 100 million because you've got equal seniority for all the liquidation preference. So 20 plus 20 plus 60. So you add it up, that's 100. So we know we're going to have a breakpoint at 100, right? But after an exit value of 100, what could possibly happen next in terms of the first key event that would happen in terms of either one of the investors in the capital structure exercising optionality, i.e. exercising the option to convert preferred into common, or someone being forced to convert because of mandatory conversion. Well, in this particular case, all 3 things that can possibly happen in this capital structure are a priori possible. So first thing that could happen might be Series A converts first, or Series B could be forced to convert first, or Series C could be could voluntarily convert first. So we're going to consider all 3 of these possibilities, right? So step 1 of waterfall analysis, right? What happens first? right? Possibility 1 is that A voluntarily converts their preferred shares into common. They'll only convert if they receive more than $20 million from the conversion. So they need to get at least 20 million. What do they receive if they convert? Well, in that scenario, they would own 2 million shares because their 1 million shares can each be converted to 2 shares of common, so 2 million common shares. If they convert, and if they're the first one converting, i.e. they convert before mandatory conversion by Series B, then there would be a total of 14 million shares outstanding. The 10 million shares owned by founders, the 2 million shares of participation that goes to Series B, and the 2 million shares that Series A gets from conversion. So they would own basically 2 out of 14 million shares. So 1/7 of the common equity value. What would be the common equity value? It would be the exit value of the startup minus all the other liquidation preference that still exists on the company's capital structure, right? So there would be the 20 million that is still owed as liquidation preference to Series B, because Series B is participating preferred and has not hit their mandatory conversion yet, right? Because if A voluntarily converts first, by definition, what we mean is mandatory conversion hasn't occurred yet. And then the 60 million in liquidation preference that goes to Series C. And so we can solve this equation or this inequality. And so if we solve this inequality, we get V greater or equal to 220 million. So by the way, we look at this, we automatically know that Series B is not going to mandatory convert before Series A converts, because Series B only is forced to convert at 250. So we know that we don't even need to check the condition, does B convert first? Because they won't. They would never convert before 220, because if you're participating preferred, you would rather never convert, because participating preferred gets the benefits of both liquidation preference and conversion. Yes, Ryan.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so we did 2/14. I understand the 10 comes from the common equity of the founders. The 2 comes from the Series A, the 2 times 1. Why did we take 2 for Series C if it's a convertible preferred?
Look, each contract is independently negotiated. So basically what that means is the Series A contract negotiated a 2-for-1 conversion, whereas I said 1-for-1 for Series C.
Oh, sorry, I think my confusion is just Series C. It's a convertible preferred, right? So.
Yeah, but it's a different convertible preferred.
Okay.
Yeah. So literally every round of investment is a different security. So it can have different terms in the contract, right? So all I'm saying is the Series A contract said every share of preferred that you convert transforms into 2 shares of common. That doesn't mean every other preferred has the same ratio. And all I'm saying is Series C has a 1-to-1 ratio.
Is the other 2 from, I'm just reading.
This other 2 is because of the 2 million shares of participating to Series B. So Series
Okay,
B,
yeah, that's what I was asking. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the reason, right? Exactly. You want to understand where this denominator came from. It came from founders have their 10.
Yeah.
Series A has the 2 that they just converted into.
Mm-hmm.
And participating preferred has their 2 in participation.
Right. So the 2 from Series C is not part of the denominator.
Yeah, the denominator is, so Series C is not part of the denominator.
Okay, perfect.
Because we're assuming first, that A is converting first. And so if A is converting first, C has not converted yet, so they have no shares. They just have their 60. So this is the only thing that C gets. B gets this and this. A gets this, and founders get this.
I think I just misheard. I thought you said the 2 came from Series C in the denominator. Yeah.
That might have been, I might have misspoken.
My bad. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Ken.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so we know that for each round, the terms are negotiated. So, but for example, if there are 2 different investors for each round, usually do they have the exact or similar terms, or it's different also?
Yeah, so the norm is that 2 investors in a common round have the same security.
Okay, all right, thank you.
It's a bit of an open question as to why that's the norm, because you could imagine a setting where, you get a really prestigious investor and that's very active in adding value to the startup versus a more passive investor. You might think, well, shouldn't the more active investor that's going to help increase value for the firm, shouldn't they get more economics in the transaction, so favorable terms? So it just turns out in practice that generally doesn't happen. In principle, you can get some additional share allocation if you are a board member in a startup, right? So you might get some extra shares that way, but even if you look at the main VCs, they don't tend to get they tend to just take the economics from the funding round. So so that's the norm. There's not a specific legal reason why that needs to be the case, but that is the norm in practice.
All right.
Go ahead. Eugenie?
Yeah. So just for the denominator, by adding 2 million shares for Series B to the denominator, do we assume that B's participating preferred occurs before A converts? And is that correct?
Well, so participating preferred means that you don't need to convert. You get both. You get the 20 million and you get the 2 million shares. So the moment those shares have any value, Series B is effectively getting 2 million. So the reason why I'm including the Series B here is because they just automatically get those shares in addition to their liquidation preference. That's the definition of participating preferred.
Right, yeah. Okay, thanks.
No problem. Yeah, the only thing is that so basically what that's saying is participating preferred gets to keep this while getting this until they're forced to convert. And the moment they're forced to convert, they'll still get this, but they're going to lose this. And we'll get to that in our next step. You have a question, Bruce?
Yeah, I just want to know the numerator is 2 because 1 times 2.
Then yeah, exactly. So 1 million times 2 for 1 ratio. Same thing. This one was 1 times 2. Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, the other point that I was making here is because 220 is less than 250, we know that participating preferred will not voluntarily convert before A converts, because we know that A wants to convert at 220. But what we don't know yet is whether C might want to convert before A. So we need to check that, right? So our next option is C voluntarily converts first. So what's the decision rule for Series C? Well, Series C needs to get at least 60 million. That was their 60 million in liquidation preference, right? What do they get if they convert? Well, they also get 2 million shares. And again, they get 2 out of, I guess, 14 million. But now this represents 10 million to founders, 2 million in participation to B, and now the 2 million shares that go to C. And now it's V minus 20 minus 20, right? So notice the difference in the equation. We have 60 instead of 20 because 60 is the liquidation preference to Series C. And we have the minus 20 here because that's the liquidation preference to Series A. Right? Series A has 20 million liquidation preference. And if C is converting, the 60 million in liquidation preference drops out from the total remaining liquidation preference for our company. So if we solve this inequality, we get a V greater or equal to 480 million. Right, so 60 times 7, is that it? 60 times 7 plus, okay, so I guess it's 460, not 480. Right, so that's basically when C would convert first, if they were converting first. Now, of course, we look at these two scenarios. This is if A converts first. This is if C converts first. Well, we clearly see from these calculations that indeed A converts first, because we always pick the one that gives us a lower threshold for V. So that means starting at a 220 exit value, Series A converts. So then the second step, we'll find out what happens next. All right, so step 2. What happens second? Right, the two possibilities are either Series B hits their mandatory conversion or Series C voluntarily converts. So Series B hits mandatory conversion. We don't need to do any calculations there. That's if V greater or equal to 250 million. And then the other option is Series C voluntarily converts. By the way, when we do this calculation here, mechanically, the answer we're going to get is going to be above the 460 that we calculated earlier. So we don't need to do this calculation again, but I'll do it just to illustrate this statement. But in some sense, we know in step 2 that this is going to be the right answer. The second thing that's going to happen is mandatory conversion, because our answer from the prior step for Series C was already above $250 million. But I'll just illustrate that here, right? So if we take a look at the decision rule for Series C, the decision rule for Series C is, again, they would get 2 million shares. But now when they convert, if they're the second one converting, so they convert before Series B hits their mandatory conversion, now how many shares would there be? There would be 16 million shares, right? 10 million shares to founder, 2 million shares to the Series A, who have already converted per step 1, 2 million in participation to Series B, and then the 2 million shares that Series C have. What would be the outstanding liquidation preference now? There would only be the 20 million in liquidation preference still owed to Series B at this stage, because B, if Series C voluntarily converts before B hits mandatory conversion, would still get their 20 million in liquidation preference. And that would have to be greater or equal to 60 million. And so if we do the math here, you're going to see we're going to get an answer that's bigger than the 460 million that we had in our prior calculation. So we can see this is 1/8, 480 plus 20, 500 million. So indeed, the second thing that happens is that Series B hits their mandatory conversion. So now the only thing we need to do is figure out what happens third or last. And now we're just left with one option, right? So the last thing that can happen, or the last thing that will happen, is that C is going to voluntarily convert. So at what exit value? Does C convert? So C now chooses to convert. When they convert, they get 2 million shares. We've got the 10 million shares to founders, 2 million to Series A, still have 2 million shares to Series B, because once B converts, they own the 2 million shares. The only thing that's changed is that they now no longer get 20 million in liquidation preference as well, right? So when participating preferred is forced to convert, right, they keep the shares, but they lose their liquidation preference. So 2 million shares to Series B, but it's not as participation, it's as actual share ownership. And then the 2 million owned by Series C. But notice the difference between my prior, right, what I calculated in the prior step and my new equation is that now C is going to get this percentage, which is the same as this one, but of the entire exit value V, because there's no longer a $20 million liquidation preference to participating preferred, because by being forced to convert, participating preferred loses that 20. So this needs to be greater or equal to 60. So if we do the math, we get V greater or equal to 480 million. So this gives us all our breakpoints for our payoff diagrams. So let's go and figure out our payoff diagrams for each of the 4 stakeholders. Right, we're going to have payoff diagram for Series A, let's say, Series B, Series C, and for founders as a function of exit value V. And we've determined our breakpoints, right? First breakpoint was 100 million. Second breakpoint was 220. Third breakpoint was 250. And then final breakpoint was 480. Bruce, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, if you already know Series B will like convert first, why is the like second step unnecessary?
Sorry, what?
Like the number 2 under step 2.
Yep.
Like, since I already know Series B will convert first, do I like does Series like the calculation unnecessary?
Yeah. So this calculation was unnecessary precisely because this number was above 250 in step 1, right? I just wanted to kind of give you guys the equation just to give you guys another example of reasoning through the calculation. But indeed, you could have skipped this calculation and just said, look, since 460 is larger than 250, I know that B is going to hit mandatory conversion first. So you could have saved a bit of time.
Thank you.
No problem. Now, one important observation in order to be able to figure out here, I'll start kind of mapping out some of these payoff diagrams, and then I'll introduce the important difference between this example with mandatory conversion and the example that we had done at the end of class last Friday. So the way I like to build these payoff diagrams is I build them from left to right. So what do we know about founders? Founders get nothing up to 100 million because there's 100 million in liquidation preference. Now the liquidation preference is 20 to Series A, 20 to Series B, and then 60 to Series C. So that means A has 20% of the liquidation preference, B has 20% of the liquidation preference, and C has 60% of the liquidation preference. So from 0 to 100, they split their liquidation preference per that ratio. So we could say 20 out of 100, it's slope of 1 out of 5. That just means A has 20 out of the 100 million in liquidation preference, and all of the liquidation preference is equally senior. Same thing, Series B, slope of 20 out of 100. And Series C has a slope of 60 out of 100. Notice the sum of the slopes across all payoff diagrams will always be equal to 1. So now let's think about what happens next. So what happens next, Series A at 100 million has hit their cap. So their payoff is flat because they're not converting, they're just keeping their 20 million. What about Series C? Series C has also hit their cap. So they're getting no extra payoff. Right? They hit their like liquidation preference cap is what I mean. This is because both of these shares, A and C, have no participation. So when they're not converting, they have a slope of 0. What happens between 100 and 220 for founders and Series B? Well, founders and Series B each have some slope because B has some participation for now. So what's the respective slopes for A and B? Well, A has 10 million shares and B participates with 2 million shares. So there's 12 million shares total, of which 10 million is owned by by founders. So founders get a slope of 10 over 12 because of the 12 million shares outstanding. Whereas Series B gets a slope of 2 out of 12 because they own, as participation, 2 out of 12 million shares. Again, the idea is you always ask, how many shares does B have? How many shares are there total? Shares total was 10 plus 2 million. So far, so good? So now what happens at 220? At 220, Series A now converts into common equity. So they have shares as well. So now there's going to be 14 million shares outstanding because there's also the additional 2 million shares owned by Series A. So they're going to own two out of 14 million shares. This dilutes the upside of Series B and founders respectively. So they get slightly lower slopes. 2 out of 14. And 10 out of 14. And since Series C still hasn't converted, they're just getting their 60 million still. So they have a slope of 0. right? So far, this looks very similar to the procedure that we did at the end of last lecture. So nothing in the logic I've said so far deviates from what I had explained in our prior example. But now we get to the point where we have a difference between this example and what we had done last lecture. Because at 250, that's where mandatory conversion kicks in, right? So in particular, Series B does not want to convert, but they are now forced to convert. So what that's gonna do is it's gonna lead to a discontinuous drop in the payoff diagram for Series B. So what we're gonna wanna do now is figure out, at an exit value of 250, how much does the payoff diagram of Series B drop? And respectively, we'll wanna figure out what happens to the payoff diagram of Founders, Series A, and Series C. So at mandatory conversion point, our goal is to figure out discontinuities. In payoff diagrams. So first, let's figure out the discontinuity for the Series B investor. Look, so the approach to figure out the discontinuity and payoff diagram for each stakeholder is to ask the question, what would be my payoff just below a $250 million exit value, where I'm, in the case of Series B, where Series B is still participating, so not needing to convert, versus what is their payoff once they're forced to convert, so at 250 million, right? So for Series B, just below mandatory conversion, what I mean is like arbitrarily below 250. What level payoff would Series B get? Well, they would get their 20 million in participation, plus they would own 2 out of 14 million shares, right? The 10 million to Founders, the 2 million to Series A, and the 2 million in participation that they receive. What would be the residual value of common equity? Again, just below 250, it would be essentially 250 minus the 20 that they're still getting, minus the 60 that Series C gets. So this is the payoff just before 250 that Series B would receive. So if you do the math here, you get a number equal to 44 and 2/7. So if you just kind of do the arithmetic here. Meanwhile, what would be the payoff to Series B at mandatory conversion? Exactly at mandatory conversion, well, now the Series B does not receive their $20 million. So this disappears and they just own 2 out of 14 of the company. But notice now, because this liquidation preference disappears, common equity is worth more as well, because you don't need to pay out that 20 first. So they own 2 out of 14 of now 250 minus 60, because you don't need to pay the 20 to Series B anymore. And so if you do the math here, you get 27 and 1/7. And so if you look at the difference between these two payoffs, right, What this is saying is at 249.9999, arbitrarily number of nines, million in exit payoff, Series B was getting 44 2/7 million. The moment you hit 250, their payoff falls by 17 1/7 million to 27 1/7 million. Right? The drop is the difference between these two numbers is equal to 17 1/7 million, right? This is a dramatic drop in the payoff for Series B, right? So company's exit value improves, but there's a substantial negative impact to the payoff of Series B. Yes, Esteban.
Yeah, Professor, I think I understood why you took off the -20 in the equation, but can you repeat why you also took off the 20 at the beginning?
Because here, B gets liquidation preference here, and shares, where the shares was this, right? This is kind of adding up both things that Series B is getting when they get to participate, right? Meanwhile, in the second scenario, B only gets shares. So they've lost this 20, but their shares are worth a little bit more because 20 is no longer being taken out. They're a net loser because they preferred to get 100% of that 20. Now they're getting just 1/14 of that 20. In fact, I think, one way to think about this is 17 is, it may actually be like 13/14 of 20. Like you used to get 100% of that 20. Now you just get 1/14 of it because you still get some of it because of your equity ownership, right? So that you lose the 20, you lose this 20, but you get some of it back through a higher value of equity, right? But since you don't own 100% of the equity, you don't get all of it back. By the way, this number here for participating preferred that's forced to convert will be systematically lower than the liquidation preference. Again, because you lose the liquidation preference, but equity correspondingly goes up in value a bit. So you get some of that loss back. So that's kind of what's happening here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So we've got a drop of 17.7 million at 250. But notice there's no change in slope for Series B at 250 because they had 2 million shares of participation before, and then they have 2 million shares of ownership once they're forced to convert. So the number of shares they have and the number of shares that are outstanding in total are still the same. So you still have a slope of 2/14, but you have a drop of 17 1/7 million. By the way, one thing that you should keep in mind is what happens at a mandatory conversion point does depend on whether the security that is forced to convert is participating preferred or is convertible preferred. If it's participating preferred, you'll have something like we see in this sketch right now. The slope here and the slope here are going to be the same. If instead you have convertible preferred that is being forced to mandatory convert, then what you'll see is a change in slope and a drop. Because before the mandatory conversion point, you're just sticking with your liquidation preference. So you own no shares. You're forced to convert, so now you own some shares. So what you'll see is, you know, a flat payoff, a drop, and then an increase in slope. Right? Because after you're forced to convert, you do now own shares that you used to not own. So if you want to see an example of that, my example with mandatory conversion from the My Courses document, I can tell you guys which document it is. Give me 1 second. It's the document called Extra 3-Round Waterfall Problem. It's like a 13-page handwritten PDF document. If you look at that example, there I have an example where the security with mandatory conversion is convertible preferred rather than participating preferred. So I would contrast those two scenarios to give you guys a feel of the two different things that can possibly happen around mandatory conversion, right? You can either be given mandatory conversion where the security with mandatory conversion is participating preferred, that's what we're solving here, or where the security with mandatory conversion is convertible preferred. That's the other example that I've posted on My Courses. Folks okay with this so far? So look, the next step that we need to figure out is, okay, this is a drop of 17.17 million. The loss to Series B is a gain to the combination of the other stakeholders, right? So how much does each stakeholder gain? So let's take a look for each other stakeholder, right? So for Series A. Series A, just below mandatory conversion point versus at mandatory conversion point. So just below mandatory conversion point, Series A owns 2 million shares out of 14 million of 250 minus 20. Notice they don't have participation. That's why I don't have, that's why I only have an expression for common equity ownership, minus 60. So that's the payoff to Series A at that point. That gives us 24 2/7 million. Now what happens at the mandatory conversion point? They still own the same percentage of the company, but now common equity is worth more because we don't have the participation. Sorry, we don't have the liquidation preference still received by Series B, right? This drops out because B is now forced to mandatory convert. So if we do the math here, we get 27 1/7 million. So if we look at the difference, there's a jump. The jump is equal to 2.67, 2 2/6 million. What about founders? Right, just below. Founders are getting 10. These equations are pretty much the same, just with 10 million shares rather than 2 million shares. So founders now get, so in this particular case, they get, I think it's 121 3/7 million. And at mandatory conversion point, they now get 10 and that gives us 135 5/7 million. So now we have a jump of 14 2/7 million. What about Series C? So Series C has no change. They don't have any jump or drop, right? Because they own no equity, right? Because they don't convert until 400, what was it, 480 million, I think, if I recall, right? So just below and at, in both cases, they're still just getting their liquidation preference of 60 million, right? So when any stakeholder that at a mandatory conversion point owns zero equity or participates in zero equity will always get a zero jump or drop. So no jump or drop. And so now, given this information, we can go and basically complete our waterfall analysis, right? So what we said is Series A has a jump of 2 6/7 million. So plus 2 6/7 million. Again, because there's no additional shares outstanding following mandatory conversion, because mandatory conversion was to participating preferred, still have a slope of 2 out of 14. Series C, because they own no shares, aren't affected by mandatory conversion. They're still getting their 60 million. And then founders still have their slope of 10 out of 14. But they get a more notable jump. Their jump was, I don't remember what the number was. Oh, 14 2/7 million. Right, so that's the key step to be careful about when you're dealing with a waterfall analysis with mandatory conversion, is that you have to go through this exercise where you figure out what are the jumps and drops for every stakeholder. Those, basically, this sums up like the two most complicated cases in an individual step of a waterfall analysis. The two most complicated things that you might need to deal with are either participating preferred with a cap, where you need to figure out when do you hit your cap. That's what we did in our exercise last lecture. Or with mandatory conversion, needing to figure out your jumps and your drops. That's what we did in this example. So those tend to be the most complicated steps of a waterfall analysis. So now we can go figure out the last step of our waterfall analysis, figure out what happens at 480 million in exit value. At 480 million in exit value, now Series C converts. So since Series C converts, they now own also 2 million shares. So now there are 16 million shares, right? 10 million to founders, plus 2 million to Series A, plus 2 million to Series B, plus 2 million to Series C. That's 16 million total. So now they have a slope of 2 out of 16, and that dilutes the upside of every other stakeholder. So founders now have 10 out of 16. Series B has 2 out of 16, and Series A has 2 out of 16 million as well. Any questions about this?
Just a question. Probably you already mentioned it and I missed it, but could you just simply rest 17 1/7 by the 2 6/7, and then you get the jump on the founders instead of doing the whole.
Yeah, so Esteban brings up a good point. So notice, like, you know, the loss of one stakeholder adds up to gains to all the other stakeholders. So this is like a time-saving trick that you can do. Actually, it's pretty useful in the context of a time exam, for instance, is notice that 2 plus 6 over 7 plus 14, 2 over 7 is equal to 17, 1 over 7, right? So the drop is equal to sum of gains. And so what that also means is you can actually, if you want to save time, so if you don't want to have to go through you know, this calculation and then this calculation all over again, what you could have done is just, you know, step 1, get this first. Step 2, maybe get this second, and then just take the difference between those two numbers, and that would give you exactly this number. So you can kind of save your, you can skip doing the last calculation by just taking drop minus all the gains you've calculated so far, all the jumps. So absolutely, that's something you can do as a time-saving trick. Sound good? Right, so the moment you knew 17 and 1/7 and you knew 2 and 6/7, you could have subtracted the two numbers and that would have given you this 14 and 2/7, which then you could have just used that. Again, allowing you to bypass these this set of calculations. So absolutely, that's something you can do because you know that the sum of the jumps and the drops is always equal to 0. Any other questions about this?